I was standing in my own kitchen when my son looked me in the eyes and told me that if I would not borrow money for him, I needed to get out of the house I spent 30 years building. He thought I was just an old woman holding on to land and memories. He did not know that one phone call could bring a luxury convoy through a Montana snowstorm 30 minutes later. He did not know the people arriving still remembered the life I once saved. And he definitely did not know that the truth about our family was about to destroy everything he thought he understood. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for most of my life, I believed a home could survive anything if the people inside it remembered how to stay grateful. That belief lasted longer than my marriage, longer than my flying career, and longer than the steel screws holding together the lower part of my spine. But on that winter morning in Montana, standing alone in my kitchen before sunrise, I began to understand that some homes do not fall apart all at once. They crack slowly, quietly, like ice spreading across a frozen lake. The snow had started sometime during the night. By dawn, the fields behind the house were covered in white so smooth it looked untouched by the world. I stood at the stove listening to the low whistle of the kettle while wind brushed softly against the windows. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, mixing with old cedar wood and the faint scent of leather drifting in from my workshop behind the barn. I had lived on that land outside Bozeman for 32 years. Every fence post, every stable door, every worn floorboard carried fingerprints from another version of my life. Before the ranch, before the saddle shop, I flew rescue helicopters through wildfire smoke across the Rocky Mountains. I spent years pulling stranded hikers and burned firefighters out of places most people would never dare enter. Back then, people trusted my hands. They trusted my judgment. One mistake in the air could bury everyone below. Then came the crash. The doctors told me I was lucky to walk again. I did not feel lucky at the time. I felt unfinished. So I came back to Montana and built something quieter with the years I had left. Saddles, horse tack, a small life made with patient hands instead of roaring engines. I poured coffee into my old tin mug and sat beneath the faded rescue photograph hanging near the stove. Every morning, I cleaned the bronze rescue badge beside it with the corner of a cloth. The habit stayed with me longer than the career itself. Upstairs, I heard footsteps. Michael had not been sleeping much lately. My son moved through the house differently now, heavy and restless, like someone carrying invisible weight across his shoulders. His adventure tourism company had started failing months earlier. At first, he hid the stress well. Then came the late phone calls, unopened mail, and long nights staring into darkness from the porch. Lauren handled things differently. She complained. The ranch was too isolated. The winters were too harsh. The smell of leather from my workshop gave her headaches. She spoke about Denver, Colorado the way some people speak about salvation. Modern restaurants, luxury apartments, investors, a better life. Some mornings, I barely recognized the silence sitting between the three of us at the breakfast table. What hurt most was remembering the boy Michael used to be. He once slept beside the horses during blizzards because he worried they might feel lonely in the cold. He used to sit beside me in the workshop asking endless questions while I stitched leather under yellow light. Somewhere along the way, money became the only language he trusted. I opened the kitchen drawer, looking for spare matches, and paused when I saw the old satellite phone resting beneath folded receipts. I stared at it for several seconds before quietly closing the drawer again. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Then I heard Michael coming down the stairs. When he stepped into the kitchen, his face looked pale from exhaustion. In one hand, he carried a thick folder, and before he even spoke, I felt something inside this house begin to break. Michael set the folder down on the kitchen table hard enough to make my coffee ripple inside the mug. The sound echoed through the old house more sharply than it should have. Outside, snow drifted sideways across the pasture fences, while the wind scraped softly against the walls. Inside, the ticking clock above the stove suddenly seemed louder than anything else. I looked at my son carefully before touching the papers. His face carried the kind of exhaustion that settles deep into a person after too many sleepless nights. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes. His jaw looked tight enough to crack. One of his hands rested flat against the table, but I noticed the faint tremor in his fingers almost immediately. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to fall asleep in the barn, wrapped inside horse blankets during winter storms. Then he started talking, and that memory disappeared. The company was collapsing faster than he expected. Investors had backed away. Insurance costs had doubled after a rafting accident the previous summer. Loan deadlines were approaching. The bank wanted new collateral before the end of the week. Every sentence sounded rehearsed, repeated too many times inside his own head. $750,000. That was the number sitting quietly inside the folder between us. I never opened it. I already understood enough. That kind of debt did not ask for help. It swallowed lives whole. Lauren entered the kitchen midway through Michael's explanation, carrying her phone and a cup of untouched tea. Her coat looked expensive against the worn wooden cabinets behind her. Even standing still, she somehow managed to look impatient with the entire house. She spoke carefully, almost gently, which made the words colder somehow. The ranch was becoming impossible to maintain. The property taxes kept increasing. Montana offered nostalgia, not opportunity. People our age were moving toward easier lives, warmer cities, modern communities. I looked around the kitchen while she talked. My former husband had built half those cabinets with his own hands before cancer buried him 15 years earlier. Michael learned to walk on that pine floor. Every beam above our heads carried pieces of our family inside it. To Lauren, it was outdated property. To me, it was proof that our lives had once meant something solid. Michael grew more frustrated the longer I stayed quiet. He began pacing beside the table, running both hands through his hair. He spoke about business, competition, timing, survival. Somewhere underneath the anger, I could hear fear clawing at him. Then came the sentence that changed everything. If you will not borrow money from me, then get out. Silence followed immediately after. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. I looked at my son, truly looked at him, and what hurt most was not the anger in his face. It was the distance. He no longer saw me as his mother standing across from him. He saw an obstacle, a signature, a piece of land standing between him and disaster. Lauren turned away toward the sink without saying a word. That silence told me enough. My knees ached as I stood from the table. Neither of them tried stopping me while I walked down the hallway toward my bedroom. The house felt strangely unfamiliar suddenly, as though I had already become a visitor inside it. My room remained simple. An old pilot jacket hung beside the closet. Rescue photographs rested inside dusty frames. At the foot of the bed sat the military storage box I had carried through almost every chapter of my life. I opened it slowly. Beneath folded maps and emergency supplies rested the satellite phone. I had not touched it in over 30 years. The number still lived in my memory. When the call connected, I said only 6 words. I need that favor now. Nothing more. Back in the living room, Michael stared at me with confusion darkening his expression. I put on my old winter coat and stepped outside onto the porch. Snowflakes landed softly against the wood beside my boots, while the cold settled deep into my spine. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Inside the house, I could hear muffled voices discussing banks, deadlines, and damage control. They believed I was trying to frighten them emotionally. Maybe they thought I would come back inside crying. Instead, I watched the road. At exactly 30 minutes, the ground beneath the porch trembled faintly. Then headlights appeared through the white storm. 3 black luxury sport utility vehicles rolled slowly toward the ranch. Behind me, the front door opened sharply, and for the first time that day, I saw fear enter my son's eyes. The 3 black sport utility vehicles rolled slowly through the falling snow until they stopped just beyond the front gate of my ranch. Their headlights stretched across the frozen ground like pale ribbons cutting through the storm. For several seconds, nobody moved. The engines hummed softly beneath the wind, while snow drifted across the fences and settled against the tires. I stood on the porch with my coat wrapped tightly around me, watching quietly. Behind me, I could hear Michael breathing harder than before. Lauren had stepped outside too, though she stayed near the doorway as if unsure whether she wanted to witness what was happening or hide from it completely. The first vehicle doors opened. 3 men stepped out wearing dark winter coats and leather gloves. They moved with the calm precision of people used to protecting important lives. None of them spoke much. Their attention settled on me almost immediately, not with suspicion, but with unmistakable respect. That was when the rear door of the middle vehicle opened. Richard Hale stepped carefully into the snow. Time had changed him, of course. His hair had turned silver decades earlier, and age had carved lines along the corners of his face. But his posture remained steady. Even beneath the heavy winter coat and black scarf, he carried himself like a man accustomed to responsibility. Michael shifted beside the porch rail, probably assuming Richard was a banker, an attorney, or some wealthy investor connected to the loan situation. Then Richard removed his gloves. Without hesitation, he walked directly through the snow toward me and lowered his head in a deep bow. I came as soon as you called. The world behind me seemed to stop breathing. I looked at Richard carefully while the storm moved around us. For one brief moment, I no longer saw the billionaire businessman whose name appeared in financial magazines and private aviation news reports. I saw a terrified young man covered in ash and smoke 35 years earlier near the forest of northern Idaho. The wildfire had spread faster than predicted that summer. Entire sections of forest exploded into flames before emergency crews could evacuate the area completely. My rescue helicopter had been flying through smoke so thick I could barely see the ridges beneath us. Richard had been trapped with several firefighters after a fuel truck overturned near the canyon road. Everyone else wanted to pull back. I stayed. By the time we got him into the helicopter, he could barely speak through the smoke damage in his lungs. People remember the day they almost die. Richard never forgot mine. Behind me, Michael remained completely silent now. I could feel confusion spreading through him like cold water. The version of me standing on that porch no longer matched the quiet saddle maker he thought he knew. Lauren looked far more unsettled than surprised. Her eyes moved nervously between Richard and the vehicles behind him, as though calculations inside her mind had suddenly stopped making sense. I did not explain anything to either of them. "There are things I need to handle," I said quietly. "I will be gone for a few days." Michael finally found his voice, though it sounded smaller than before. He asked who Richard really was, but I never answered directly. Some truths arrived too late for simple explanations. One of the men opened the vehicle door for me. The gesture carried more respect than I had felt inside my own home that morning. As I stepped off the porch, snow pressed softly beneath my boots. My back ached from the cold, but I kept walking without hesitation. Before entering the vehicle, I looked once toward the ranch. The barn stood behind the house under falling snow. The workshop light still glowed faintly through the storm. For the first time in years, the property did not feel like home. It felt like a chapter quietly closing behind me. I entered the vehicle. The heavy door shut with a deep, final sound. As we drove away, Michael remained standing in the snow beside Lauren, both growing smaller through the rear window while the ranch faded into white distance. Inside the warm silence of the vehicle, Richard sat across from me with his hands resting calmly against his cane. "I waited 35 years for that phone call," he said softly. I turned my eyes toward the mountains ahead while snow swept across the road. Then Richard spoke again. "There are things about your son you need to know." The mountains disappeared behind curtains of snow as the vehicles carried us deeper into northern Montana. I sat quietly beside the window, watching pine trees blur past beneath the storm, while the ranch slowly faded somewhere behind us in darkness. Strangely, I did not feel rescued. I felt exposed, as though the life I had carefully kept sealed for decades had finally begun opening on its own. Richard spoke very little during the drive. That was one reason I trusted him all those years ago. Some people rush to fill silence because they are afraid of what might rise inside it. Richard understood silence the same way old pilots understand bad weather. Respect it. Listen to it. Do not fight it unless necessary. By the time we reached his estate near Yellowstone Lake, the snowfall had grown heavier. The property stretched quietly across the hillside, surrounded by security lights and frozen trees, impressive without looking wasteful. Wealth lived there, but it was controlled wealth, disciplined wealth. Nothing screamed for attention. Inside, warmth settled around me almost immediately. Pine logs cracked softly inside a stone fireplace, while staff members moved through the house with practiced discretion. Richard led me into a private sitting room overlooking the dark lake beyond the windows. "What do you need from me?" he asked. I stared into the fire for several seconds before answering. "I want the truth about my son." Nothing in Richard's expression changed, but he nodded immediately. Within minutes, calls were being made. Attorneys, financial investigators, analysts, quiet people whose entire careers depended on uncovering the things others buried beneath paperwork. That first night, I barely slept. I sat beside the window long after midnight, watching snow collect against the frozen shoreline, while memories kept circling inside my head. Michael at 8 years old riding a horse too large for him. Michael running toward me after rescue flights with dirt on his boots and questions spilling out faster than I could answer. Back then, he looked at me like I carried certainty inside my hands. Somewhere along the way, that certainty disappeared. The first financial records arrived the following morning. I spent hours reading every page carefully. Transfer reports, investment agreements, property discussions, outstanding loans. I approached the documents the same way I once inspected damaged aircraft equipment after emergency landings. Ignore nothing. Small failures destroy entire structures. At first, Michael's business records looked stable enough. The company had experienced growth during its early years. Problems began appearing only after Lauren started overseeing financial decisions. That detail sat heavily in my chest. Richard remained mostly silent while I reviewed the files, though I could feel him watching me closely. He understood each line of paper was stripping away another layer of the life I thought my son had been living. Then I found the transfers. Small amounts moved repeatedly through shell companies connected to a real estate investment group operating around Bozeman. Individually, the numbers seemed harmless. Together, they formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Richard finally spoke. The same investment group had quietly purchased several struggling ranches throughout the region over the past 2 years. Geological surveys suggested large underground mineral water reserves beneath portions of the land. Suddenly, Lauren's behavior made sense. She had never wanted a temporary loan. She wanted the property itself. One internal note froze my hands completely. Evelyn is hiding something valuable under that ranch. I read the sentence 3 times. Lauren had convinced Michael that I was protecting secret wealth while refusing to help him. The pain of that realization settled deeper than anger ever could. My son truly believed I would choose land over him. Richard asked quietly whether I wanted everything exposed immediately. I shook my head. People do not learn when they are cornered. He understood instantly. I was not trying to destroy Michael. I was trying to save whatever remained inside him before fear and humiliation buried it completely. Late that evening, Richard handed me one final document. The bank intended to seize the ranch within days. An auction date had already been prepared. I stared at the notice while firelight flickered across the pages. Outside, snow continued falling across the lake in silence. For the first time in many years, I felt something old returning inside me. Not anger, resolve. The morning of the auction arrived under a sky the color of cold steel. Snow from the previous storm had begun melting along the roads around Bozeman, leaving behind dark slush and muddy tire tracks. I stood near the front entrance of Richard's estate, pulling on my old rescue jacket, the same one I had worn during my final year flying through wildfire country. The fabric no longer fit comfortably across my shoulders, but it reminded me who I had been before life became quieter. I was not going to the auction to win. I was going because I refused to let my family disappear beneath someone else's greed. The drive into town passed mostly in silence. Richard sat beside me reviewing legal folders, while snow drifted lightly against the windshield. A few miles outside Bozeman, he finally shared one more detail his investigators uncovered. Lauren had already signed preliminary agreements with the investment group. If the ranch sold successfully, she planned to leave Montana immediately. I listened without surprise. Somewhere over the previous 48 hours, disappointment inside me had hardened into clarity. The truth no longer shocked me. It simply settled into place. The auction hall sat inside a plain commercial building near the edge of town. Fluorescent lights washed the room in cold white glare, while bankers, land brokers, and investors moved between rows of folding chairs, carrying coffee cups and legal documents. Nobody there cared about memory. They cared about acreage, mineral surveys, and profit margins. I spotted Michael immediately. He sat alone in the second row, gripping a thick folder with both hands. His clothes looked wrinkled, his face pale from exhaustion. For the first time since all of this began, I saw something deeper than anger inside him. Fear. Lauren was nowhere in sight. That absence stayed with me. The auction began exactly on schedule. A woman near the front podium started reading property descriptions in a practiced voice. Acreage, water access, structures, development potential. Every sentence reduced my home into numbers designed to attract buyers. The bidding moved steadily. Michael watched each increase with nervous intensity, believing higher offers meant survival. Even then, he still did not understand he had never been included in the real plan. Richard remained silent beside me, waiting. When the auctioneer raised the gavel for the final confirmation, I stood. The room shifted almost immediately. Conversations faded. Chairs creaked softly as people turned toward me. I walked down the center aisle, slowly carrying the legal folder Richard prepared earlier that morning. "This sale cannot continue." The words were calm, but they cut through the room cleanly. Richard stepped forward beside me and handed the documents to the auction coordinator along with federal preservation records. Within seconds, confusion spread across several faces near the front tables. The ranch had been protected under a historical aviation rescue conservation agreement issued decades earlier after the Idaho wildfire operation. Commercial transfer rights on portions of the land were heavily restricted, which meant the mortgage agreements tied to the sale contained serious violations. The auction coordinator's expression changed instantly. Attorneys began reviewing documents while whispered conversations spread through the room like wind moving through dry grass. Michael stood abruptly. "That is impossible." I looked at him across the room and felt no satisfaction at all, only exhaustion. "You tried to sell something you never understood." Then Richard revealed the final piece. Years earlier, developers had offered me $20 million for access to the land and underground mineral rights beneath the property. I refused every offer. Silence settled across the hall. Michael stared at me as though he had never truly seen me before that moment. The auction collapsed within minutes after that. Investors gathered papers. Lawyers made calls. People left frustrated and confused while the room slowly emptied around us. Still no sign of Lauren. Michael remained standing alone beside the chairs after almost everyone disappeared. When I finally walked toward him, his voice sounded hollow. "Why would you still stop this after everything?" I studied my son carefully before answering. "Because losing your soul is more expensive than losing money." Outside the windows, snow began falling again, while Michael slowly lowered himself into one of the empty chairs, staring at nothing. And for the first time, I think he finally understood how close he had come to destroying himself. By the time the auction hall emptied, the silence inside the room felt heavier than the storm outside. Folding chairs stood crooked across the floor, while scattered papers remained abandoned on tables near the front podium. Somewhere in the hallway, I could hear distant voices from attorneys still arguing over documents. But inside that room, everything had slowed into something quieter and far more painful. Michael had not moved. He sat staring at the floor with both hands locked together so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. The anger that once filled him seemed gone now, burned away by humiliation and realization. For the first time in months, maybe years, I saw my son without the defenses he had built around himself. And what remained looked exhausted. Richard stayed near the far side of the room pretending to review paperwork, though I knew he was intentionally giving us space. Some conversations cannot survive witnesses. Michael finally lifted his head slightly. He asked about the $20 million. The question came out rough, almost ashamed. I looked toward the snowy windows before answering. Years earlier, a development company approached me with plans to turn the ranch and surrounding land into a luxury mountain resort. They promised private air access, geothermal spas, exclusive cabins, and enough money to change several generations of our family forever. I refused before negotiations even finished. That land held my husband's ashes beneath the cottonwood trees behind the barn. Michael learned to ride horses there. I rebuilt my life on that property after the helicopter crash nearly ended everything. Some places stop being land after enough years pass. They become memory itself. As I spoke, I watched understanding slowly settle into my son's face like a wound opening from the inside. He realized I had never protected wealth from him. I had protected home. The shame inside him became visible then, not dramatic, not loud, the kind that lowers a person's shoulders because carrying their own mistakes suddenly feels unbearable. Part of me wanted to comfort him immediately. Another part knew comfort too early would teach him nothing. Michael admitted Lauren had spent months convincing him I was hiding money somewhere beneath the ranch. She showed him articles about mineral surveys and private investors. Every financial failure pushed him deeper into suspicion until eventually he stopped seeing me clearly at all. I listened without interrupting. Pain changes shape when it lasts long enough. Mine no longer felt sharp. It felt old and tired. Then Richard's phone vibrated. He stepped aside briefly before returning with the kind of expression people wear when bad news no longer surprises them. Lauren had disappeared sometime during the night. Several financial accounts connected to her had already been emptied and closed. Michael lowered both hands over his face after hearing that. In that moment, I do not think he was grieving the marriage itself. He was grieving the version of reality he spent months believing. The room stayed quiet for a long time afterward. Finally, he asked the question I had been waiting for since this began. "Why did you still come back for me?" I looked at him carefully. Not the businessman drowning in debt, not the angry man who threw me out of my own home. I saw the little boy who once waited by the porch every time my rescue helicopter returned safely from the mountains. Because I still recognized the boy underneath all this fear. His eyes closed immediately after that. He turned away slightly, trying to contain emotions he no longer knew how to hide. Michael had always been proud, even as a child. Watching him break quietly hurt more than the shouting ever did. Richard left the room without another word. I walked over and sat beside my son for the first time in days. Neither of us spoke for a while. We simply sat there listening to the wind push snow against the building outside. Eventually, I rested one hand against his shoulder. "You are not beyond saving yet." He stared ahead for several seconds before asking what happened now. I took a slow breath. "Now you learn what things really cost." When we finally stood and walked toward the exit together, snow had begun falling heavily again. But for the first time in a long while, we were walking in the same direction. The drive back to the ranch felt quieter than the drive into town that morning. Snow covered the roads again, softening the landscape beneath the fading afternoon light. Michael sat beside me without speaking much, staring through the windshield as if he no longer trusted his own thoughts. Forgiveness is strange. People imagine it arrives like warmth after a storm. In truth, it often arrives cold and exhausted, carrying scars with it. I knew bringing my son home did not erase what had happened in that kitchen. Trust does not return because someone feels sorry. It returns slowly, through effort, honesty, and time. When we pulled into the ranch, the house looked darker than I remembered. Lauren had already gone. Inside, drawers stood half open, closet spaces empty, and several framed photographs had disappeared from the hallway walls. The silence inside those rooms carried the unmistakable feeling of abandonment. Michael walked through the house slowly, noticing details he had ignored for years. I watched him pause near the kitchen table where the argument began days earlier. He lowered his eyes almost immediately. I said nothing. There was no value left in reopening old wounds. The next morning, I woke him before sunrise. Montana winters carry a particular kind of cold just before dawn, the kind that settles deep into joints and old injuries. The wind moved hard across the pastures, while pale blue lights spread slowly over the snow-covered fences. I led Michael toward the workshop behind the barn. The smell of leather greeted us the moment I opened the door. Inside, rows of tools hung neatly against the walls above work tables, scarred by decades of labor. Saddles rested on wooden stands waiting for repair. The room still held traces of the life I rebuilt after the helicopter crash took flying away from me. I handed Michael an old pair of gloves and a heavy work apron. "For the next 4 years, this is your life," He accepted them without argument. That silence told me more than apologies could. His first tasks were simple: cleaning stalls, carrying leather bundles, repairing sections of fencing damaged by the storm, organizing tools buried beneath years of use. By midday, his hands were raw from cold and effort. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion each time he bent to lift something heavy. I did not mock him. The truth was harder than that. My son had spent years chasing success without ever learning how difficult it is to build something real with your own hands. Around noon, an old pickup truck rolled into the yard. Walter Green climbed out slowly wearing his faded firefighter jacket. He had been one of the men trapped during the Idaho wildfire decades earlier. Walter greeted me warmly before turning toward Michael. He told him about the crash afterward, about the spinal injury that left permanent damage, about the surgeries, about how I still worked every day despite pain that never fully disappeared. I saw the shock settle across Michael's face. He had never known. I changed the subject immediately. I never enjoyed discussing suffering like it deserved applause. That evening, I found Michael sitting alone beside the horse barn, staring at his blistered hands. Small streaks of dried blood crossed his palms where the gloves rubbed against his skin. I handed him a cup of coffee and sat beside him quietly. I never saw any of this, he admitted. I looked across the snowy pasture before answering. Most people only see what helps them survive. The wind moved softly through the fences while darkness settled over the ranch. A few minutes later, Michael stood up and walked back toward the workshop despite the pain in his hands. And for the first time in years, I saw my son beginning to learn humility instead of fear. Several weeks passed before I noticed the first real change in Michael. Not in what he said, but in what he stopped saying. He no longer complained about the cold mornings or the endless work waiting in the barn before sunrise. Every day, he woke before dawn and followed the same routine without argument. Feed the horses, repair fencing, cut leather, clean tools, stitch until his shoulders ached. Montana winter hardened everything it touched, especially people. The work did the same. I watched my son carefully during those weeks. The anger inside him had quieted, but shame still lingered beneath the surface. Men his age often tied their worth to success, money, and control. Losing those things can hollow a person out faster than grief. One morning, Michael ruined an expensive saddle order after pulling the stitching too tight across the leather frame. The material warped immediately. He stared at it for several seconds before throwing a tool across the workshop floor, hard enough to shake the shelves. I let the silence settle first. Then I told him about my first wildfire rescue mission in Idaho. I described the smoke so thick I could barely see the mountain ridges beneath the helicopter. I admitted how close I came to killing everyone on board because I trusted my instincts more than the weather conditions. Failure never leaves quietly. It stays with you, but pride destroys more people than failure ever will. Michael listened without interrupting. For the first time in years, he was not listening to defend himself. He was listening to understand. That afternoon, we worked side by side repairing another saddle near the workshop stove. Snow tapped softly against the windows, while firelight flickered across the tools hanging along the walls. The room carried the slow rhythm of healing, though neither of us spoke about it directly. Eventually, Michael asked whether I was afraid after the helicopter crash. Every day, the answer surprised him more than it should have. I explained that courage was never the absence of fear. Courage was waking up anyway, continuing anyway, living anyway. A few days later, Richard sent updated investigation reports. Federal authorities had officially opened fraud inquiries connected to Lauren and the investment group. Several executives were already shifting blame toward her. I felt no satisfaction reading any of it. Only sadness. Michael studied the documents quietly before setting them aside. I could see the final pieces settling into place inside him. Lauren had never intended to save the business, the marriage, or the ranch. She had been planning her escape long before everything collapsed. That night, after I went inside, I noticed light still glowing beneath the workshop door. Through the small window, I saw Michael sitting alone at the workbench staring down at his hands. The skin had grown rough and scarred from weeks of labor. Dust from leather and wood covered his shirt. For the first time in years, he looked real to himself. The following morning, he finished his first complete saddle entirely on his own. Every stitch sat carefully aligned across the leather frame. He placed it on the table with the same caution people use when handling fragile things. I inspected it slowly. This one will last. Michael lowered his eyes after hearing that. Outside, the sun rose across the snow-covered fields while he stood silently in the doorway watching the light spread over the ranch. And for the first time in a very long while, my son was no longer thinking about money. By early spring, the snow around the ranch had begun to melt into narrow streams cutting through the fields. The fences stood repaired. The barn looked alive again. Even the workshop carried a different feeling now, warmer somehow, as if the silence inside it no longer came from loneliness. Time had softened things, words never could. Michael changed slowly, the way mountains change after winter. Some mornings, I woke to find him already outside feeding horses before sunrise. He no longer rushed through work or searched for shortcuts. The bitterness that once followed him around the ranch had faded into something quieter and steadier. One Saturday morning, he organized a small riding lesson for children from town. I stood near the porch watching him help nervous kids onto horses while laughter drifted across the pasture. For a moment, I caught glimpses of the boy he used to be before fear and pride buried him beneath adulthood. Later that afternoon, Richard arrived alone in an old pickup truck instead of the black convoy that first came through the snowstorm weeks earlier. We sat together on the porch drinking coffee while the wind carried the smell of wet earth across the ranch. He spoke about investors again, resorts, mineral water development, luxury tourism. According to Richard, the land beneath my property could make millions if handled properly. I looked out across the fields for a long time before answering. Not everything valuable needs to become a business. Richard smiled quietly after that. He understood me better than most people ever had. What I did not realize was that Michael had overheard part of the conversation from the workshop doorway. That evening, he found the old storage box beneath my workbench. Inside were rescue badges, flight photographs, medical reports, and faded hospital records from after the helicopter crash. The doctors had warned me decades earlier never to continue heavy labor if I wanted to avoid permanent pain. Still, I worked. Still, I stayed. Long after sunset, Michael came outside carrying the box carefully in both hands. He sat beside me on the porch without speaking for several minutes while lights glowed softly inside the horse barn. Finally, he lowered his eyes. I was blind for a long time. I looked toward the dark pasture stretching beyond the fences. Most people are, until life slows them down. We sat there together, while the wind moved gently across the ranch and horses shifted quietly inside the barn. And for the first time in many years, this house finally felt like home again. Spring returned slowly to Montana that year. Snow disappeared from the fields in thin patches at first, then all at once beneath warm sunlight and steady rain. The ranch felt alive again. Horses moved freely across open pasture. Children laughed during riding lessons on weekends, and the workshop light stayed on long after sunset. Michael worked there every day without complaint. One morning, while I stood near the fence repairing old wire, the sound of a rescue helicopter crossed the sky above the valley. The noise stopped me instantly. Even after all those years, part of me still remembered the weight of flight controls in my hands, the smoke from wildfires, and the feeling of searching mountains for people who needed saving. Michael stepped outside the workshop and stood beside me quietly while the helicopter disappeared into the clouds. "I finally understand why you stayed." I knew he was not talking about Montana anymore. I looked across the ranch, toward the barn my husband helped build decades earlier, and the house that nearly tore our family apart. A home is the one thing people should never trade for fear. The wind moved softly through the grass after that. A few days later, Richard mailed the final update from the investigation. Lauren faced federal fraud charges, and the investment group had collapsed under legal pressure. I read the letter once beside the fireplace, then fed it into the flames without hesitation. Some chapters do not need preserving. That evening, I walked past the workshop and saw Michael bent over a saddle beneath yellow light. His hands looked rough now, marked by labor instead of office work. For the first time in years, he seemed peaceful. I did not interrupt him. I simply turned off the porch light and looked out across the dark Montana fields beneath a sky full of stars. Home was never the land, the money, or the buildings. Home was the place where people finally learned how to value each other again. And for the first time in many years, I no longer feared losing what truly mattered. Some people spend their entire lives chasing bigger houses, more money, or the approval of strangers, only to discover too late that peace cannot be purchased. Real wealth is quieter than that. It lives in the people who stay when life becomes difficult, in the hands willing to rebuild what was broken, and in the courage to face painful truths without letting bitterness take over the heart. Time has a way of slowing people down until they finally see what truly matters. Pride fades, fear fades, but kindness, sacrifice, and forgiveness leave marks that last far longer than success ever will. In the end, a real home is never made of wood, land, or money. It is built from respect, loyalty, and the willingness to stand beside each other when everything else begins to fall apart. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If it meant something to you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments and let others know where you are listening from. And if you enjoy slow, meaningful stories like this, do not forget to subscribe and follow the channel for more journeys that remind us what truly matters in life.